Healy, and there's Mary. Oftentimes guest speaker on Vincent Brown's shows, and again speaking.
Michael Edwards, who's a sort of a philosopher in this area around citizenship and participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and he argues that there's three essential bits to civil society that are really important in making it work and gel well. One is the network of organisations and associations that can come together, and the idea that the more organisations, the more spaces there are for people to participate in and work through, the richer that society will be, the more glue there'll be in that society that will hold it together. But there's also the sense that those groups have to be united, not just by wanting to be involved in decision making, they also have to have some ethical project or some end destination that they're working towards. And I take it that that's what's meant by the idea of a progressive vision. So they want to create a good society. They might find it hard to understand what that means and to find the language, but they're all kind of united by a general common goal of trying to create a good society. And the third thing that he names as being really important is the idea of a public sphere, the place where people can come together to talk out what they mean by that, to discuss, maybe sometimes to argue in a facilitated way, but to try and get deeper and better understanding of what it takes to be in a good society. And I think that's really what you're at here, is you're actually involved in the nuts and bolts of being the civil society, and you meet each of those three criteria. You're a network of organisations, associations and individuals. You do have a common desire to create a better society, and you want to do that in a public sphere, creating conversations, whether it's public in the sense of debated in the radio, as myself and Sean are wont to do, or whether it's debated in rooms like this. And it's not easy to do that, sure it's not, because as was spoken about earlier on, there's the challenge of governance, there's the challenge of how do you make up rules that work in enabling such a broad diversity of people to come together. But also, how do these democratic spaces that are really about participatory democracy or deliberative democracy, how do they sit alongside, work with, rest with representative democracy? And I heard John mention earlier that that's really a challenge. How does the old style kind of way that we thought we organised our local areas work alongside these new ways? And they can be very much a tension with each other in terms of trying to do that. And that tension is healthy, because tension does create change, but how you manage that tension and work out new arrangements, new ways of understanding how that all works together. And I was really struck, I don't know how many of you might have voted for our President, Michael D. Higgins, but I did, and I was at his inauguration speech in Dublin Castle on Sunday night, and I was really struck when he was laying down the challenge for a new republic, or a real republic, that he was very much speaking into the kind of space that you're in. And I just want to quote a few of his words, because what he threw down the gauntlet to Irish society, I think in some respects, was he talked about what we need to do to create a life lived together in the public sphere. And that is very much what you are doing right this moment, trying to create a life lived together in the public sphere. And he talked about what we needed to be doing to be ready for those new challenges of the future, that not only equality and social inclusion will show up, but new challenges that we haven't even got our heads around, like climate change and a low carbon society. What that's going to mean in practice for us to work out in a dynamic of togetherness as to how we need to change, how we live our lives, how we organise our local communities, and how we can be the agents of that change ethically, how we can actually stand up to that responsibility. And he talked about that's not possible to do without deepening democracy, and that this is exactly what's going on here, is deepening democracy, finding new ways to do democracy, but also about extending democracy to groups that are presently not embraced by democracy. And people mightn't be involved by way of discrimination, by way of being excluded, or by way of poverty, where they simply can't afford to engage in democracy. So some of those challenges about being inclusive, I think, are quite practical in terms of understanding the real barriers that there are to enabling people to participate and being inclusive in our practice of participation. And he talked about us being decent in how we engage with each other, But I think he may have been a bit overcome with the emotion of the day, because I think that there's lots of examples in Irish history, past and more recent, where we're not always decent to each other and where we have been quite exclusionary as a people. So I do think we need to be very honest about the real challenge there is about inclusion, the real challenge there is about leaving no one behind, because people don't get left behind by accident. It's we leave people behind in our process of moving on, and I think that's very, very important. But most of all, I think he talked about society owning these spaces and the agency that we each have as people in making this happen. And one challenge I think just I'll throw out to you is in trying to figure out that relationship between representative democracy and participatory democracy, there's also the challenge of figuring out the relationship between the state and society, and the degree to which this space as a societal owned and led space is able to determine which way it shapes itself and grows. And I think there's tensions in that as well, in the relationship between the state and society, that we need to be mindful of. So I'll leave you with those sets of challenges for now, and we can come back in later on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. We're going to pick up on many of those points hopefully in a few minutes, so thank you again. Let's pass over to Sean and begin by asking something we don't know, Sean, please.
Okay, Mary I think knows this, but probably not the rest of you. But she'd have been in other arenas I've been in where we're asked similar questions. I have finished 37 marathons in my time. For 46 years, until February of this year, I was still in the Irish top 20 fastest marathon runners ever. But I was, in February of this year, Nick Clohessy, who actually finished the first Irishman in the Dublin City Marathon last month, in February he ran a marathon in Valencia that was like 7 seconds faster than me, and he became the 20th fastest Irishman. So I went 21. Well, I lasted a long time. One of the issues about, I think, if you want to generate change, is you've got to persist over it, or you've got to be a marathon runner. So something positive there. A story, Mary told a story at the beginning. I'll tell a story, a similar kind of a thing. When I was a young fellow and I was in the seminary, there were two people who came to speak to us during the course of a single year that had a huge effect on me. One of those was John Hume. At that time he was not in the public arena, he was a teacher in Derry, but he was involved in the Credit Union League of Ireland. He was the president of the Credit Union League. And he came, and there's one phrase that he used that I have never forgotten. And it was basically, it was the first time I heard it. Of course I've heard it since, but it was basically quoting Edmund Burke, that all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people will do nothing. And I was profoundly affected by that. And to this day, I would keep repeating it to people, because it is so important to understand that the only thing that stands between the triumph of evil, between us and the triumph of evil, is that good people do something. Like, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. The second one was a guy called Mike Riley. He was actually a Canadian who was over doing extension work with Maynooth and Tira, and he came and gave us a talk. And all I remember, I can't remember a thing about him other than this one phrase that really stuck in my mind. And remember, he was talking to a group of seminarians now, and he said, one thing I want to make sure to assure you is that you're wasting your time preaching morals to a starving girl. And I said, well, you know, that is so true. And it certainly gave, like, well, I suppose it's something that I hadn't thought about before, but it certainly brought it into clarity and clear perspective that preaching morals and things of that nature, these are critically important, values are very important, but at the end of the day, if people don't have the resources to live life with dignity, then they can't live life with dignity. It's as simple as that. So anyway, there are background things, if you like, in the context. I think the PPNs have developed very well, and I am very happy to see the sheer scale of how they've actually developed across the country. There are now more than 14,000 organisations who are signed on this year as members of PPNs around the country, and that's rising all the time. And these are not sort of paper organisations, that they exist in somebody's room, but that they don't actually, they're not real. They are very, very real. And they are involved in more than 1,000 committees and working groups at local authority level, and working with state agencies in different kinds of ways. And there's an awful lot of engagement and an awful lot of work that you and people like you across the country actually are doing. And I think that that's very powerful and says a great deal. But it also, I suppose, is important to think as an evening like tonight or like this evening is meant to do, to try and get us to think about what exactly are we trying to do. One of the things that's important, and I say this first, not in any sort of limiting way, but just that we have to be a bit realistic, because in effect, local government in Ireland is the most powerless of any country in the OECD. Yesterday was our annual conference in Croke Park, and one of the papers there was presented by Teresa Reedy from UCC, who's kind of a specialist in local government and stuff like that, local politics now. And she had a couple of very interesting charts looking at all of the 31 countries, or 30 whatever, there's more than 31 countries in the OECD. And in terms of local democracy, of the ones that were listed, Ireland is the last, literally the last. And when you look at the money that's available to the local authorities, among all of them as a proportion of the national money, Ireland is the second last. So I'm simply saying in that context that we have to be realistic about what can be achieved, because a lot of the time local authorities get a lot of the hard time, but in actual fact they don't have big budgets and they don't have control over a lot of their own budget either. I'm putting that in as just a cautionary note that because I think that needs to change. I think we should decentralise more. And I would support Mary very strongly in talking about we need to move towards more participative democracy and move beyond representative democracy to a situation where everybody and all sectors of society get their voice heard in reality when decisions are made. In terms of the types of things that we might highlight, I think there are 5 things. Sorry, let me say one thing first before I say my 5 things. We have made a mistake in Ireland over the past century. We have repeated this mistake many times, but we're not alone. Most countries in the world, practically all the countries in the world, have made this mistake and continue to make it. And it is this, that we believe that if we grow the economy, everything else will be okay. That if in some way or other the economy becomes big enough, then there'll be enough left over to trickle down so that everybody does okay. That has never worked. It has never worked here, and it has never worked anywhere else either. Ireland actually is a classic example of how it doesn't work in practice. What happens here? We have one of the fastest growing economies, we have one of the wealthiest economies in the world, but most Irish people wouldn't believe you if you told them that, but the numbers say that that's what we are, okay? But the problem is that most of that money and wealth and so on is going to a relatively small number of recipients. We have done very well. Employment has fallen, has grown, to record levels. Unemployment has fallen quite dramatically over the last number of years. We've done a lot of different good things. However, we also have 780,000 people in poverty. 250,000 of those are children. 100,000 of them have a job. We have 700,000 people, more than that, in fact, on waiting lists for access to healthcare, waiting to get access to be treated. We have over 500,000 homes in Ireland, in rural Ireland, without quality broadband. We have over 11,000 homeless people, and many of those are children. We have over 80,000 households on waiting lists for housing, social housing. And the thing about all of those numbers, and a lot of other numbers we could put beside them, is that the government has no plan on the scale required to solve any one of them. The plans in place, there are plans in place to tackle them all, none of them is on the scale required. So, what I would say is we need a slightly different approach, maybe a seriously different approach, that recognises, of course, the economy is important, but that other things need to be done in tandem with it. Not after it, not after the economy is right or whatever, but recognising that things are integrated, that they overlap, and they need to be done at the same time. Here's 5 things that I think need to be done in Ireland, and they need to be done at national level and at local level in the next 5 to 10 years. And if you like, I state them as like 5 things that need to be achieved, okay? And that we need to work for simultaneously now, in an integrated way. The first is that we need a vibrant economy. Of course the economy has to work, and it has to make sense. We have to have the investment that's required, and we have to run the economy in such a way that banks aren't going broke every 10 years and those kinds of things. Okay, we need a solid economy. We need decent infrastructure and services, which we don't have in a whole range of things at the moment. Like we don't have the social housing, as I mentioned, and the services are in education and health and so on. We've some serious issues to be these things to be addressed. And there was a question here earlier, or a mention here earlier on of buses and the bus system and the transport system. And I think like the public transport system is another example of a service or an infrastructure that needs to be actually developed and improved. The third area that I would suggest that we need to work for is just taxation. And we have a kind of a seriously warped tax system in which PAYE workers pay a substantial proportion of their income and they don't have any choice in the matter, whereas some of the richest corporations pay a very, very small percentage of their profits, not of their turnover or their income, but of their profits. And there seems to be no capacity to actually just even apply something like a minimum adequate or a minimum effective corporate tax rate. We've been for several years now advocating that they introduce a minimum effective corporate tax rate of 6%. In other words, that corporations had to pay 6% of their profits in tax. Now, they claim they're paying 12.5%, but of course they're not. And if there was 6% as a minimum that they had to pay, we'd actually be $1.5 billion better off each year. So it's that kind of thing. Just taxation. So a vibrant economy, a decent infrastructure and services, just taxation. The fourth area is good governance. Ireland has suffered a great deal from poor governance, poor regulation, poor oversight, and the crash is just one of the things that has happened. Part of our bad governance is the fact that we have taken power steadily away from local authorities. And the little power that they had is being eroded as well. So we sort of completely oppose the idea of decentralisation and letting people make decisions at the level that those decisions can be made at. So good governance. I would argue, for example, that we need quite a new approach, a social dialogue kind of approach that involves all sectors of society on an ongoing basis, being able to argue and discuss and look at the evidence. And we look at all the terrific work done by the Citizens' Assembly. Like, that's just 100 people, but they do a huge amount of work and they've had a huge amount of impact already. Now, what I'm simply saying is we can mirror that type of process with all the sectors of society present in it. And there's no reason why something like that couldn't be done even at a local authority level, but it needs to be done at a national level. Finally, but not lastly at any rate, remember all of these things have to work together. The fifth and final thing is sustainability. Because if we're not sustainable, then we're not going anywhere. And it isn't just sustainable for the rest of our lives, but it should be sustainable for this and future generations. And it's not just, though it is very important that we be sustainable on the environment, but we have to be sustainable on the economy, and we have to be sustainable in society. Is the society we are building a society that anybody wants to live in? Because if we build a society that nobody wants to live in, that's not very sustainable. So sustainability is about environment, it is about economy, and it's about society being sustainable. So all those five, I think, together need to be done need to be worked on, and maybe I'm close to exceeding my time at this stage. But anyway, I hand back. They're the kind of things I think that can be handled both and developed and worked for, insofar as we can do it at local level and then do it at national level, but do it in an integrated way. And as I said, let's stop repeating that mistake we've been making for 100 years. Let's stop with the economy first and everything else. Bill Clinton's old thing about it's the economy stupid, he was wrong actually. And I think he himself might even begin to understand that at this day. And I think what he should have said is the slogan should have been, it's not just the economy stupid.
Thank you, Sean, and again, thank you, Mary, for both of your contributions. So lots of food for thought, lots of really interesting points made. And now we'd like to hear from you. Before we do, I should have mentioned, because Jamie did ask earlier on, to let you know that we are on Facebook Live at the moment. So just in case, if you have your mobiles on, if you want to really look at it as it's happening, although you're here so you don't need to, but if you want to let your friends tune in, then the numbers could go skyrocketing. There'll be loads of new likes on Jamie's page. Okay, so over to you. So please, comments, questions or observations for either of our two speakers, please. And if you don't mind, if by way of introduction, would you just give us your name, please, and the organisation that you would most associate with, because if you work with 5 or 6, please don't introduce all of them. So the main organisation or entity that you work with, and if you can keep it brief in order to get through as many as we can. Thank you.
Do I need that? Yes. Okay, Jamie. Thanks, Bob Dowling, the PPN. One, thank you both for very informal insight to the way you're thinking. I just noticed that Sean mentioned our local democracy and the failures that may exist, or perceived failures that exist within our system. And I'm just thinking in terms of the way we have been structured. Our democracy level, as we all know, is based on the old British system. Our governance is based on the old British system. And in light of our future departure from our European former cousins, I suppose, in that direction, I'm just wondering, because there's failures there in our system, there's a challenge to our executives within our local governance, because they have to operate like a corporate entity. And our representatives are trying to work into this system, which often turns out to be adversarial rather than cooperative. I spend a lot of time on the continent, and I'm fairly aware that the local governance systems on the continent is much grander on the scale that we have, much more involved in local issues and more powerful to do something about them. I'm just wondering, both your thoughts on this. Should we look at the way we organise our local government system, bring it maybe more in line with a European model, which would perhaps open up that little bit better? It does have its problems, like all systems, but it might be something that we should consider in this country going forward. Maybe your opinions on that one, please?
That's great, thank you. If we can take one or two more, if you don't mind, so both speakers can then maybe address a few simultaneously.
Yes. Hello. My name is Edward Stevenson. I'm with the Swords Woodland Association. Thanks very much. I've heard both of you speak on other occasions. I'm thinking of the fact that Catherine Murphy had to ask 23 parliamentary questions to get access to information from members of the Department of Finance. I'm thinking of some of the problems that happened with the HSE and patients not being allowed access to their files, etc. Is access to information that is timely and meaningful not critical to this civil space that Mary talked about? Is it not almost impossible to have participation if gatekeepers are involved in starving the public of the information? And even more importantly, when they're found to be engaged in that, are they not really attacking the concept of civil society? They're engaged, almost deliberately in trying to make it harder for people to participate.
Thank you. So maybe if we can take one more question or comment or observation, and then we'll go to both of our speakers. Thank you. two.
George Monby is my name, and my group is Swords to Towns. And my question is, how do we take the PPN to the next level? How do we get more money? And how do we get more power?
Easy questions there for both our speakers, eh? Thank you for that. And then last of this round, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Lorcan Blake is my name. I represent the Hope Peninsula Heritage Society. And I make this observation to both speakers that the opportunity for the existence of the PPN itself, not alone here in Fingal, but throughout the whole country, is because of the failure of democracy itself and the apathy in democracy. I would say that the collapse of the banking system, the failure of the church and other institutions has added to the failure of democracy. And I would agree with Bob that it's an opportunity for us to take a look at the structures that represent us going forward.
Thank you. So if I can go to Mary first, if you don't mind.
Very challenging questions for this time of the evening. I think maybe just working backwards. Peter Mayer is probably one of the best political scientists that came out of Ireland. He died a few years ago. But one way he described Irish citizens was as being quite passive and stagnant. And I think it's probably true that the nature of the democracy we grew up in, the type of education we got, and talking about my generation and before me, we were taught to defer to authority in a very significant way, particularly given the role of the Catholic Church in relation to the education system. And I think we have a very underdeveloped concept of what it means to be citizens and what it means to be actually a civil society. We're only really beginning to unpack some of the potential power that there is in society, and having a kind of society that has the capacity to hold state institutions to account. I think to some degree we're only copying in the last decade or so that we have that power to play, that any democracy doesn't work very well unless its citizens are active in holding the state power holders to account. And I think you're right that we don't have the laws around transparency, around freedom of information, that enable us to do that effectively yet. And to some degree, it is a sense maybe of a kind of a state or a set of political institutions that were underdeveloped at the start of the development of the Irish state for lots of reasons, got to do with the previous history of colonialism and then the context in which the Irish state developed. We did inherit too much maybe of our ex-colonisers' infrastructure and didn't think out what we needed for ourselves as a new state emerging. And some of what we put into place was wrong. Local government isn't powerful enough. Central government is too powerful. The culture of secrecy in the Department of Finance and the Department of Justice is there and needs to be unpacked and moved on. And I think very much when we're in this decade of commemorations, no better time to be doing it, because to be looking at, well, what did we build 100 years ago as the foundations of the state institutions, national and local, and what do we need to do to really bring it up to the next level? Which would mean things like looking at the nature of how local democracy and local government works in other Central European countries, and how we could have a different imagination about what that would be, not simply looking to our nearest neighbour on one side or even on the other side, because neither of them are leading by good example at the moment. I think that's fairly clear. So I do think that there are immense challenges there that I wouldn't, underestimate, but I wouldn't necessarily see the glass half empty either. I think, there's some really wonderful examples in Ireland of citizens leading the way, of what does happen when the institutions are changed and citizens are allowed to deliberate. They're well capable of showing serious imagination in how they can see things changing and coming about differently. And I think we're actually in the process of the doing. Sometimes it's hard to see that you're actually creating a new way of imagining how we live and make decisions together. But you do it as you go along, and sometimes it's very murky and it's hard to see. So I'm actually relatively optimistic right now that we are copping on, that we need to reimagine how we rule the country and how we hold the rulers to account, and that we are capable of taking the learnings from elsewhere. And just words from Seamus Healy there, just whatever is given, it can always be reimagined. That's one of the lines in Saturday one of his lovely poems. And I think it is about having political imagination and having the courage to work on it and to act on it. But I would be relatively optimistic that particularly our younger generation, changes in the education system, that there is evidence that this is capable of being changed.
I think I agree with much of what Mary is saying, but I would also sort of caution against thinking that there's some model out there that we can just copy and set up exactly. And too often, like when Mary or myself, people like us, raise issues and suggest ideas, the first thing you're going to be asked, or we're asked, is like, where is that actually happening? And we're saying, well, maybe we should do it ourselves. Like, why does it have to be happening anywhere? And very often people are not, in a decision-making context, are not prepared to do anything that isn't practiced or already worked out somewhere else. We have two things. One is that, in effect, the continental systems of government, we have a lot to learn from them. They're far more they engage with people far better than we do. The average Irish public representative has about 5,500 people per representative. In France, it's like 442 per elected representative. And we think that, like our government, the last big sweep was to actually reduce local government dramatically and reduce it from 100 and something down to 31 local authorities and get rid of the whole layer of stuff that was in there. Okay. The other piece is that historically, I think we probably misunderstand what's actually happened across much of Europe as well. But I think maybe let's not spend too much time on that. I think the critical issue is that we need a genuinely participative, deliberative type of democracy that respects the views of other people, that respects difference, that respects the right of everybody to have a say, to have their voice heard, and to have that voice part of the decision making incorporated into it, and to develop ways of making decisions where there are profound differences, and it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to come to an agreement on what's right and what's wrong or whatever, but they just have to agree in how to proceed, and then they can check some things out, and if they work, great, and if they don't, we are committed to redoing it or whatever. Okay, I think that's the kind of issue that I would look at. The issue of gatekeepers keeping the information away is one of the ones that drives me really mad, because I think we have a right to all the information, and that both Mary and I have been for a long time part of a sort of an effort to have policy developed on an evidence base. And like sometimes in more recent times, I would feel that we're moving further away from this. That like policy tends to be now built or driven an awful lot of the time by emotion or by whatever is popular or fashionable, and certainly don't bother me with the facts isn't confined to the President of the United States. You know, it's not too far away from ourselves. So it seems to me that there is a huge issue about information, and that we have a whole culture of gatekeepers basically attacking not just civil society, but attacking democracy. Because if we don't have the actual information, it's very, very hard to make serious decisions. How PPNs can get more money and more power? They're going to get a bit more money. Just pointed out earlier on that there's a likelihood that there will be some more money coming through PPNs in the coming year. But I think that the challenge, I think, will be for PPNs to be able to be effective and basically build the capacity and the reputation. And I think that using that kind of base of saying, okay, we've been able to achieve this and that and do this and that, you're actually able to build up kudos that actually forces people to give you access to more money and more power. Remember something, I think that's very important. Most people do not give up power willingly. And if people have power, whether they're civil servants or politicians or whoever, they find it extremely difficult to give up the power that they actually have. And I think that they will only give it up when the majority of people basically say, we're not satisfied with the way things are, we want things done differently, here's how we want things done. And one of them is not you having all the power, basically, okay? To do that, I think we have to have some kind of idea or some pretty clear analysis and understanding and evidence of where we are, but also some clear ideas of where we want to go. And I think if we had both of those in place, and I think that's the way to sort of move people towards more engagement, less apathy, and less sort of signing off or giving out, but not doing anything about the weaknesses in the democracy that we have. And then I think we'd be in a place to kind of engage more people in more effectively in sort of building the kind of society that the vast majority of people here tonight and the vast majority of people across this island would actually prefer to see. Something that had genuine values that we were talking about earlier as at the core of the society itself.
Thank you again to both Sean and Mary. We're going to have another round if you don't mind, but just to pick up on something that Sean mentioned earlier on in terms of the economy. Within broader development, if you like, discussions, and development can be very much grassroots in local communities. It doesn't have to be just international development. I think Sean picks up a really interesting point. The myth around the economy driving all outcomes. And it's a myth, but what's really important is that myths are really important. Is that storytelling, the power of a story doesn't lie in whether or not it's real. The power of a story lies in whether or not people believe it's real. So it's the belief behind the story that's crucial, rather than whether or not it's based on evidence. And sadly in development there's too many examples of policy being based on strong stories, but with no evidence. And I think that's something that we need to be conscious of, because just if I don't mind, just to provoke a little bit, I think another story that we can buy into too easily is that power sits somewhere else. And I think that's a real danger within community development more generally, that we look to government, whether it be local or national, and believe that's where decisions are made. Of course, they play their part, but as do all of us. And I think there's a real danger and a kind of a disempowering impact if we believe that we don't have a say. And I think that phrase that's often associated with Nelson Mandela about our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but powerful beyond measure, is something that we could take forward a little bit more. Because if you look even at some documentaries that have come out over the last couple of years of well-known politicians, the likes of Barack Obama, they follow much more than they actually lead. That public pressure can really change a politician's mind. And I think it's not to underestimate how powerful we all are. I'm very conscious of time. I know that you have another piece of the jigsaw to get through this evening. So if you don't mind, if we can take one or two more brief comments or questions from Mary or Sean before we wrap up, if you don't mind, Jamie. And we will try to keep them brief. Thank you.
Thank you. You gave a lot of information this evening. I have a question. You mentioned 5 important things. They are really useful. The one that you mentioned, the infrastructure and services. I want to talk about public transport that we have, especially in Dublin. We can't even travel directly from Source to Blackstone at the moment. So you have to go to the city and then take another bus. 2 hours. Now we are talking about Brexit and then more jobs coming to Ireland and all this stuff. So if we don't have infrastructure and services, particularly the housing and transport, what will happen? So what is your opinion and what do you recommend?
Thank you, and then there was just one other final hand, if you don't mind. Thank you. Thank you. So if you don't mind, oh, there is one more, Jamie, is there? Yeah, absolutely, yeah, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Brendan Jones, my name. And power, control come to mind. And we have the power, if we want to change things. We have what's known as the vote. And it is so important for everyone to use that vote, because there's no point in saying this is not getting done, that's not getting done. We have the power by going and voting for the people who are going to do things for us, and if they don't, then you don't vote for them the next time.
Thank you. So if I can go to Mary, if you don't mind.
Yeah, just on the public transport, and I think it's a really good example of the way we need to change our mindset just about what's possible if we want to have sustainability. My car was stolen on Halloween morning, and because of that I ended up chatting a lot with people about car ownership over the last couple of weeks, and I was really struck by the amount of people when I said I'm not actually going to replace the car. I figured out I don't really need it, and I'm going to go on a go-car system where you can hire a car every hour that you need it. And it just made me realise that, you know, we really don't think imaginatively enough about how we can replace the role of the market and individual ownership of things in our lives in order to create that sustainable economy and society and environment that we need to live in the future. So whether it's about, you know, reducing consumerism in our own lives, using libraries more, but basically the idea of collective responses to meeting our needs on a more sustainable basis. And I think if we don't get our heads around public transport as the basis of that sustainable way of making our lives work, that we're on a hiding to nothing when it comes to climate change. I really do, so I would totally take in what you said. In terms of why can't you get a job in this country, I mean, I do believe it's a really good example of the lack of commitment to the concept of leaving no one behind. That you could get a job in this country if there was a policy, ambition and imagination to try and put in place the supports and structures that need to be there. But I genuinely believe that this country genuinely has written off a significant number of people in terms of saying, well, we can get on with a growing economy, a vibrant economy, without the participation and inclusion of everybody in that economy. And that's the model that we've picked for the moment. Personally, I don't think it's good enough, and there's no way that we can achieve any level of social inclusion without that kind of economic inclusion. So I do think it's not right, and that there are better ways of doing it.
Because I can't read or I can't read. Why? It's the can't do.
Sorry, could I say something on Shane's behalf? Just
Yeah, sure.
sorry. I have the mic, just.
Thank you.
How are you doing? My name is Andrew McCormack. I'm Shane's PA. I'm his community support worker, one of his team. And what he's trying to say to you is, because of his issues, educationally, because of his disability, he didn't ever have the people put enough input, he believes, and I believe, in teaching them how basic stuff, really, writing and so on. The guy is fantastic, he's a great networker, he's a great communicator, but he feels trapped by his situation. And just one point, we contacted Enable Ireland recently on Shane's behalf, right? And we asked them, is there any chance Shane can get access to adaptive technology? The response he got, I couldn't believe. We can allow you to try some adaptive technology, but we're going to charge you €500 for the privilege. Now, I mean, I just find that ridiculous. And you said about inclusion and leaving nobody behind. And this organisation is called Enable Ireland. How does that enable Shane? He doesn't have €500. So that's one thing. He's sorry, Shane?
I will get this I will get this I change this what he does and try to make harder for me.
Shane basically feels hamstrung. He's on a CE scheme at the minute, working with, I'm not saying the organisation, that wouldn't cause any trouble or any friction, but the outcome for him, I've witnessed the first hand with him. He spent some of his day and he has a joystick attached to a fantastic computer, a great piece of equipment, but without the ability to spell or to write, now I will do the best I can and use his words and transcribe for him. But if I told you some of the days he spends colouring in something that a 3-year-old child would colour in on a screen, on a touch screen on a lovely computer, fantastic. He wants to better himself, he wants to have a job, he wants to be part of a good, civil, wonderful organisation, great people, everybody's looked after and there's nobody's left behind. And he truly, truly feels like he's been left behind. And he struggles with that, and he just, I mean, we all know there are doors, they're not open to everybody, but talk about kicking some doors down, he feels like he's beating his head off on some of the days, and just seems to be getting left behind. That's probably it.
Thank you so much for the contribution. If I can go back to Mary before we go to Sean.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, some of those issues that both Sean and myself would have raised in relation to, I mean, there is an absolute absence of the inclusion of people with disabilities in our activation strategy at the moment, in terms of actually who we have ambition to get back to work. And we don't stretch it as far as people with disabilities at the moment, and that's very real. So maybe I'll finish just on 2 points. The gentleman who spoke about we have power, and it's about the vote. But it's also about the various ways that we will be standing and trying to shape the society we're in. And I suppose I just want to end on a comment about gender, because to my mind, one of the things that I've noticed now is that all the comments from the floor were from men, and there's been no comments from women. And I'll just put it back as a challenge in any democratic, participative and deliberative spaces. It's a challenge for both. You know, it's a challenge for how we use our power and the practice of how we relate to each other, and checking our privilege, but also taking responsibility to participate as well on the other side. So I just wanted to remark on that, because it's very practical in terms of how do we create inclusive, challenging spaces that everybody feels they're able to participate in, but also that people will take the risk to participate in as well. Just wanted to leave it with that.
I go back to the issue about, you know, public transport. You mentioned housing as well. Let me tell you, to me now, I'll give you 2 examples of how everything that gets done in this country is so disjointed, and things are not joined up, and we don't kind of integrate what we're doing. Take the housing issue. I was in Cork a few days ago, and they're looking very closely at what do you call Apple are bringing in 2,000 new jobs, okay? And over 1,000 of those will come in from abroad. Now, what's going to happen, because those 1,000+ people, I think this is part of what you were referring to, like that 1,000+ people are going to have to be accommodated in Cork. Now, Cork is the second worst after Dublin record, our situation with regard to waiting lists and homelessness and all of this. So what's actually going to happen? They come in at the top, okay? Because they're able to pay a lot for access to the accommodation. They'll drive up the price, so they get those. Others will drop down to the next layer, and they'll drive the price of that up, and down it will go until 1,000 people are going to get pushed out at the bottom. And there is no plan, thing I mentioned earlier, there's no plan of any scale to put in the kinds of housing that's required to match the numbers of people we're talking about bringing in to keep the economy growing. Something completely missing out of the thinking. Another variation of the exact same thing. We decided we have this huge 2040 strategy and the sort of growth strategy behind it in the previous few years, and driving growth again. And one of the things, one of the areas that we're going to see huge growth in is in exports of meat and dairy products. But that means in effect that we've had to bump up the number of cattle in the country. So we've gone from 1 million cattle to 1.4 million in a few years. That means we're 400,000 extra cattle. And they are one of the great methane producers. So now we're in the process of not only are we not going to achieve our 2020 targets, we won't achieve our 2030 targets on climate. In fact, we're going away from them, not towards them. Now, again, the issue about joined up thinking, it seems to me absolutely crazy. So, while I was talking about those 5 things that I thought needed to be done, they need to be done in an integrated way because they're all very interdependent. And if you can't put in, like if you have to put in the services and the infrastructure, you have to put in the taxation, you have to put in the participation, the governance, and you have to put in the sustainability if you're going to have the vibrant economy. And without all of the other pieces, you won't have that either. You certainly won't have well-being for everybody. Which brings me to the other piece about comment on the disability issue. I think that well-being for all is the critical issue, and not just well-being for some, or well-being for people who have jobs, or well-being for people who have well-paid jobs. And that's why the point that was being made earlier about things that are coming in the next while with PPNs, all PPNs in the country are developing statements of well-being for this and future generations for their own area. Now, one of those issues in well-being, if you're going to get well-being for all, has to be addressing the issue of disability. If a person has a disability, that person has an additional cost. Depending on what the disability is, the cost may be large or small. But the payment of that cost, whatever it would be, should be part of what we do to ensure well-being for all. It's not a thing about that we can ignore sectors of society. And go back to what Mary said, like leaving nobody behind. Like, if we're to leave nobody behind, then we have to secure the well-being of everybody. And that means, it's like Brexit is Brexit. This actually means something. Everybody means everybody. Okay? It's not about this group or that group, or a few groups and others left out. It's a huge challenge. But they're the kinds of conversations we should be having. And it seems to me that that's the critical area. Like, an arena like this, a group like PPNs across the country, are ideally placed to have those kinds of conversations, to drive those conversations, and to drive them into the political arena where decisions have to be made. Making the point that what we want is a society that secures well-being for everybody and that nobody gets left behind. Like the Sustainable Development Goals say, leave nobody behind. Those Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to apply in all 193 countries that signed it, including Ireland. Ireland played a great part in putting the Sustainable Development Goals together in the UN. We're not playing nearly as big a role or as good a role in actually delivering on them in the country itself, in our own country. Thank you.
Guys, can you... I'm sorry, but I am getting signs that I do need to wrap up. Apologies, I know that both Mary and Sean are very interesting, engaging, and I think that in terms of examples of role models and active citizens, can you please join me in giving both of them a round of applause, please? It might be the case that if you did have any further questions that after separately that you might be able to engage with either of them. So I'm going to hand back to John and Jamie, and thank you so much to you for your participation. Thanks a lot.